Okay, so one attribute that I did not mention, and I thought I would dedicate a whole segment to it, is the style attribute. And I'll talk more about styling and all about CSS in the CSS tutorial a bit later. But there is an attribute to style individual elements in HTML, and I think that's important to know about. So let's see. Let's say I just delete this. Oh, that's page 3. Example.php. Okay, so now it's completely not styled. Okay. So let's say I want to style this welcome thing to have a very big font. So I can just say style, and using this syntax, which is the same syntax as in CSS, so I can say style font size, and you can use any property and any value that you would use normally in CSS. So let's say font size 70 pixels. You can see that it will apply there. And I personally think that using too much of the style attribute is not a very good idea, because if you're trying to style everything using this, your HTML page is going to be extremely crowded, and it's a very good idea to keep it as neat as possible and just keep it to the HTML elements and attributes and just the head and the body without any extra languages interfering with the layout. And especially if you're working in a team, it's very important that it's very clear. So it's not a good idea at all to use the style to style everything, because if you start putting all the values, so if you want to put color, red, text, decoration, if you want to underline it and put all these values in here, it just gets very, very messy when you could just make another file and write all the CSS there, and then it's all very, very easy, although you see that it works. So maybe the style is not something to use too much, but there are a few situations in which it is important. So let's say I just get that style, the style in the head here. Okay. So now we have it styled as it was before. Okay. Now let's say I want to have this have a unique styling, and we talked about using IDs and classes to distinguish between individual ones. But a very quick way to do that, instead of having to make a new class, instead of having to make a new class and then write that class here, or make a new ID and write that ID here, you can just write it in line. So it's a very quick way to do if you just want a little change that is just an exception, and it's not going to apply to any other elements. Instead of having to write an ID, so like this here that I made the ID big div for the hello world, I could have just, instead of doing that and having to write it here, I can just take the font size like that, not have to recrowd the CSS, and just say style equals that, and there we have it. It's the same. So in that kind of situation, it's very useful. But it's important that it will only happen if it's an exception. If you think that you're going to have more than one div that is going to have font size 70, and is this going to be the same size, same position as that, it's not a good idea to do that, because then you're going to have to make more elements that will have this annoying style font size 70 pixels, which is just going to crowd up the HTML, which we don't want. So if you do have that, then add it to another class, or give it at least an ID, just to make it a little bit clearer. But in this kind of situation, it works very well. Another thing that the inline CSS, and when I say inline CSS, it just means by using the style attribute, because you're writing the styling, so the cascading style sheet values, but just in line with the element instead of putting it in the style because those are the different ways of linking the CSS, is writing it in a style, having it inline, or referencing an external style sheet through link. So using inline has one more advantage, which is that of the important tag in CSS. So let's say I say that the class of div needs to have the color red. Okay, needs to have it red. And I want to override this value here that says that it needs to be blue, even though it comes afterwards, and it's specific to welcome div. I want every single of the div class to have color red, no matter what anything else underneath it says. I can just put exclamation mark important. Okay? So you can see here that everything is going to be red, no matter what happens. But and this often happens if you're working in a team and other people write parts of the CSS code and you don't know what's written underneath, and somehow, let's say for this welcome thing, you see it blue, but you really want all of these red, and you must think that your teammate made a mistake. So you just put the important, and that will override any color blue that he might have written in the rest of the CSS. So putting the important is just going to override it. So this is up in hierarchy from this. So the important is going to override that. But higher than this important, so putting the important in the style, is the inline important. So if your teammate again says, well, actually I really want that blue, then what you can do as the teammate is put style equals color blue, and if I just put color blue without anything else, it will still override it. The welcome will still be red, because the important is higher in hierarchy than that, and higher in hierarchy than that. But if I put important here, then this is going to override everything. So that's going to become blue. So even if you put important here, putting important here is going to be the final decision. So if your teammate really wants this to be blue and he puts important here, it's going to override whatever you put, if you put important or not. So that's why style can come in very useful, because it's the only way to really override all other options. So yeah, I mean, you'll learn much more about all the CSS stuff later. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about is this thing called comments. And comments in code are very important. And the reason why that's so is because it makes the code incredibly easier to understand. And a comment in HTML is just denoted by opening tag, and then exclamation mark, and then two dashes, and then you end the comment. So you put this is a comment, and you end it with 2 dashes and a closing tag. And what this does is, you can see in a Notepad++ that it grays it out a little bit, and that means that this is code that will not be run. And it's a great way to describe what comes next. So this is the navigation bar here, let's say. So let's put that this is, what we say, beginning of navigation bar. Is that how you spell beginning? Yeah. And then you can put that at the end. You can just say as well. Oops. You can say end of navigation bar. And here it might seem obvious, but in huge pages with tons of HTML, having these little comments is very useful, because you might just completely, and again, this is even more important if you are working in a team, because if you write a whole page of HTML and then you send it to your teammate to complete maybe the back end part of it, and he doesn't understand the page at all. That's a big problem, and these comments are the best way to make sure that that's not a problem. So here we can say that we have div column, and then div column and so these pieces of text won't get run. But what might happen, what will happen actually, is that they will still be loaded to the server, and you can see from the server. So you can see that if you inspect the page, these comments will come up in the browser, so the user will be able to see it. So it's important that you don't put any information about the server-side script that might contain information that you don't want the users to see, because you can see it, or just putting anything stupid or jokes between the teammates, which can happen easily because you think that they're all grayed out and it's hidden from people, but actually it's one of the most obvious things that you can see in the when you inspect a page, and many people can see that. So that's one big reason to use comments. But another big reason is this thing called debugging. And you might have heard the term debugging in the computer community, and all it means is just trying to figure out where a mistake is coming from. And it's not exactly solving the mistake, because that's a different thing. But debugging is just trying to find where the mistake is coming from and where in the code it's coming from. And that maybe will make more sense in other languages, maybe like PHP, that run like a flowchart. So they just go from the top to the bottom, and then a mistake will just make it mess up at a certain point. In HTML, it works in a similar way, but the browser renders each element by itself without going in any direction. I don't know if you understand. So it's a bit more difficult to understand the concept of debugging. But comments are very, very important when you want to debug something. So let's say I have in this link here, I forget the last tag. And I don't know if that will create an error, but it should. So let's see. So you see here that this page 2 here is not a link. Okay, because this page 2 is just a floating thing, because this as you can see here in Notepad++, that little A is grayed out because I forgot to put this last closing arrow. So this is a very common mistake, that people just forget the closing arrow, and then the next element is affected by that. So if this is a huge page and you just see this, and you might have no idea why that's not a link, why that's not sending you anywhere, and it's not rendering as a link. So a very good thing to do is just to comment out different pieces of code that you might think might be affecting it. And here, I showed you what it was, so it's pretty obvious. But if you put a little comment here, let's say, and we gray out this, and we save that, then you can see that page 2 and page 3, the links of page 2 and page 3 work. So there you can resolve that since having this not being there it works, and that being there doesn't work, that means that there's a problem with that. And then you can inspect the HTML on that and see that in fact there is a missing arrow at the end, and that's the reason. And that's incredibly useful, because you might spend ages just looking for a little mistake, and if you haven't debugged the code, then it's difficult to solve that mistake, because you just don't know where it is, and you don't know what is causing it, which you need to know to solve it. So that's very important. So next we're going to talk about formatting, but that will be next.